Hi everybody. Tonight I want to talk about the renewal and crisis cycle that we often see in Jewish history. And in particular, I want to look at it in relation to Pesach and our Pesach seder, with a bit of a close-up of some of the prayers and songs that we sing during the seder night. It's fair to say at the moment, as the world struggles with coronavirus, that we are in a point of crisis. And already I'm seeing amazing examples of the way that people are responding. And that very much mirrors what we see in Jewish history. In fact, when you look across Jewish history and the Pesach journey, the Exodus being a huge example of this, it is characterized by trauma, followed by beauty that adds value to our culture. The 210 years of slavery in Egypt is a journey that leads us ultimately to receiving the Torah. The 40 years that we spend struggling in the desert ultimately leads us to the land of Israel. From the destruction of the temple and the exile, particularly in terms of the exile to Babylon, we end up with the Talmud, such a rich history of Jewish learning and knowledge that still serves us so well today. From the Spanish Inquisition, we end up with the Kabbalah, mystical Judaism. When we've got the challenges in Europe and the Russian pogroms, we end up with Hasidic Judaism. When we have the threat posed by Enlightenment and secularism, we end up with Zionism, which has led to the modern day state of Israel. So throughout and of course, when we look at the Shoah, the Holocaust, and out of the ashes of the Holocaust, rebuilding strong communities in the diaspora and ultimately a strong community in the land of Israel. So throughout all of Jewish history, we can see this constant cycle, crisis, renewal, and that is the story of Pesach, the Jewish revival after trauma. And I'm already thinking about what's it going to look like for this particular crisis that we're in. I'm amazed to see the way in which our own community have responded. The service that we had online before Shabbat this Friday had over 300 people participating. Now, on a normal Friday night at shul, maybe we get 40 to 50 people. But for this particular service, we had 300 people joining us virtually from all over. And this is an amazing example of the way that we are going to see this process of trauma and renewal play out again here with the current trauma and crisis that we're facing at the moment as well. So let's have a little look at Pesach. There are a few prayers and songs I want to focus on today, and the first one I want to focus on is the way in which we present the matzah at the beginning of the seder, and we sing or we declare Ha Lachma. And the phrase that we use is, "This is the bread of our affliction that our fathers ate in the land of Egypt. Whoever is hungry, let him come and eat. Whoever is in need, let him come." Now, it might strike you as odd that you would want to welcome somebody with the bread of affliction, and you're right. This week, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs spoke about how he's always kind of struggled with this as an idea. Why is it that we would welcome those who are in need and say, "Come, eat the bread of affliction"? But actually, there's something in this. How do we transform affliction into freedom? Well, there's a lot of power when it comes to food and sharing food. And Rabbi Sachs gave the example of Holocaust survivor Primo Levi, who was in the camps in Auschwitz. And he said one of the hardest times was after the Nazis had left the camp and the death march had begun, and there were only people who were dead and dying who were left behind, and him and a few inmates were strong enough that they decided they would try and build a fire. So together the three of them worked really hard to collect what they could to start the fire, to look after those who were sick. And what was amazing was that after they lit the fire, one of the men who was sick suggested to the other men in the room where they'd lit the fire that they should give some of their bread, some of the bread that they had, their ration, to those who had gone to the trouble to fix the fire for him and for the rest of them. And one of the things that he noticed was that when you are a slave, be it a slave in Egypt or a slave in Nazi Europe, or any kind of slave where you find yourself scared and restricted and afflicted, it's very, very hard to think of others. And actually that this was the first sign of them getting their humanity back, that the rules of the camp had basically been, you have to look after yourself. You should eat your bread, and if you can get it, the bread of the person next to you, not that you should share. And in that moment, the bread, which had been the bread of their affliction, became the bread of their freedom, because they finally had the altruism and the hope to be able to share what they had. And in that way, the bread of affliction was also the bread of freedom. And in Pesach, our sages tell us that one of the reasons we merited redemption from Egypt was that the Jewish people maintained kindness to each other, even under difficult circumstances. They didn't inform on each other. They tried to help each other. And what's more, they preserved what teachings they had and could preserve from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So, and our foremothers. So that actually was part of our redemption. The other thing that I think is worth noting about this prayer, why does it say, let him come and eat? Whoever's hungry, let him come and eat. And then it repeats it and said, whoever is in need, let him come. Isn't it kind of superfluous to say both? Well, actually, in this case, one of the things that it's representing is that there's a physical need and a physical hunger, but there's also a spiritual need and a spiritual hunger as well. And we've talked about this before, the way that the Exodus from Egypt really covers both. How were the people of Israel redeemed physically? How were the people of Israel redeemed spiritually? How do we meet our physical needs, but also how do we recognize and meet our spiritual needs and those of others as well? So that it's a beautiful microcosm for the whole Pesach story. The second song or milestone in the seder that I wanted to talk about is Mah Mishtana, the 4 questions that are traditionally asked by the youngest at the seder or collectively by the children at the seder. And there are lots of different ways of looking at these 4 questions. They're very famous and a very special high point of any seder. But I want to particularly focus on the Abenel's understanding of why we ask these particular 4 questions about the matzah, the maror, the dipping and the leaning. And the Abenel explains that these really highlight the paradox of Pesach. And as Jews, we're good at sitting with paradox, right? There's so much paradox that we need to be able to sit with and be comfortable with. And as much as we might like life to be black and white, it very rarely is. So sitting with paradox is really, really important. And there are different symbols all around the Seder table which really tap into that idea of enslavement. We've got the matzah, the maror, the salt water. Absolutely, there's a focus on slavery. And yet paradoxically, for a child looking around the table, there's also a beautifully set table. There's wine, people are reclining, they're dipping their food, all of these things that tend to symbolize freedom and even affluence. And this is the paradox we sit with. This is absolutely a festival that is about slavery, but it is absolutely a festival that is about freedom as well. And by asking these particular 4 questions, one of the things we're getting children to do is engage with this paradox and to see that Pesach is both. And not only that, but it starts to tap into the idea that the Jewish idea of freedom is somewhat different to the postmodern idea of freedom as well, right? Postmodern idea of freedom is you do whatever you want, right? That's free. You're free to do whatever you want. But the real freedom is to be free to use your time wisely in the best way possible. And that's one of the beautiful things that we're seeing around the world now. Yes, there are some people who are using their freedom to take advantage of the situation, but mostly people are using their freedom in order to protect others by staying at home or to help out and be kind to each other. And this is something that we've seen throughout our history, is that freedom is about responsibility too. And so that's another message that we take from the Pesach Seder. Finally, I wanted to look at the Dayanu prayer and then finish with a story about Pesach, about a Passover seder. So Dayanu is the amazing song that goes through a range of the different miracles that we saw performed for us through the Exodus from Egypt and beyond. And for each of them, it answers Dayanu. It would have been enough for us, or it would have sufficed for us. And I actually remember probably a decade plus ago, I ran for the first time, I ran a half marathon. It was a bit more than half. It was 22K, I think. And I remember I was kind of running and struggling quite a bit. And then I got into a rhythm going up a really steep hill. And I started thinking of this song that we've always sung at the Pesach Seder, Dayanu. It would have been enough. It would have sufficed. It would have been enough for us. And I started just kind of singing to myself the Dayanu and reminding myself of all the blessings that I had that would allow me to complete that race. You know, Dayanu, even if I only had these legs, it would be enough. Even if I'd only eaten the banana that I had for breakfast to give me a little bit of energy, it would have been enough. Even if I had only been wearing good shoes, it would have been enough. Even if I'd only had good socks that weren't giving me blisters, it would have been enough. And going through, it enabled me to see how little I really required to be able to do what I needed to do, but also to have the gratitude for each of the blessings that I had in trying to finish this race. Now, interestingly, with the Dayanu, as we go through, you know, it would have been enough if Hashem had divided the sea, but not let us through on dry land. Or it would have been enough if he'd let us through on our dry land, but our oppressors wouldn't have died. It would have been enough if our oppressors would have died, but even if he hadn't provided for our needs in the wilderness, and so on and so on and so on. Now, would it really have been enough? No. To get to the stage of where we needed to be, we needed all of the miracles to happen in order to become a nation, to receive the Torah, and ultimately to be able to serve Hashem in the temple in Jerusalem. But by going through that process, we appreciate each of the miracles, we have a sense of gratitude, and we also tap into a very powerful number, and that's the number 15. Dayanu goes through 15 stages of miracles. Now, one of God's holy names, when you Yud and Hey, that's 15. We've also got 15 materials that are used in the building of the sanctuary, which some commentators talk about as the purpose of our Exodus, was to be able to build the sanctuary. We've got 15 generations that take us from Abraham through to Solomon. So from the first Jew through to the king who built the temple. We've got 15 steps, physical steps in the temple when they go from the forecourt until the inner court. And we've got the 15 stages of the seder itself. As we go through the seder, you'll see there are 15 seder stages that we move through too. So this number 15 is very significant, and it's something that is also symbolized through the Dayanu. On a side note, my mum's name's Diane, and her nickname when she was little was Di, and she really thought when she was little that the song was being dedicated to her. Di, and so she always loved it, and so I'd just like to dedicate my learning tonight to my mum and her love of Pesach and all that she's done to make sure that it ended up being my favourite festival as well. And this is the first Pesach in a long time where we're not going to be together physically, because, you know, we're all separated to protect ourselves and each other during the coronavirus outbreak, but we will definitely be united spiritually. And finally, I just want to finish with an amazing story about a German opera singer, Foulke. She was one of the most famous German soprano opera singers before the war broke out, before the Shoah, the Holocaust. And she was married to a man called Josef Weiss, and together they managed to escape to Holland, where they thought they were safe. But after the Nazis invaded Holland, they had to give up what they were doing in Holland, which was mainly trying to serve and protect others and see if they could help others escape from Germany, and get them to safety. And they were transported to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. And in the camp, they took on leadership roles, caring for other people and running infirmaries and trying to help those who were unwell. And it was 1945, Pesach, 1945, and this was at the end of March, and Erna said to her husband, you have to go around and you have to talk to each of the barracks that we look after, and you have to speak to them and inspire them. And Yosef said, I can't do it. He said, how am I meant to go and say Ha Lachma? How am I meant to say Ha Lachma? The prayer that we spoke about earlier about whoever is hungry, let him come and eat. When I know these people are starving and I know we don't have food for them, how can I say that? And Erna says, not only do you have to go and say that, you need to make that the basis of your drosh, of your sermon that you give to the people tonight for Pesach. And so he went around to speak to them, and he openly said, this is a paradox. How can I say all those who are hungry come and eat when we have no food? But he said, what we do have is we have words and we have courage. And he said, just hold on 5 minutes longer. This was the 29th of March, 1945. The end was in sight. And he said, just hold on. We may be the few European Jews that survive this. Just hold on. By May 1945, they had were liberated and had managed to survive the war, but unfortunately 14 days later Erna passed away. And one of the great tragedies was that when she died, her voice died with her. She was an incredible singer, but because all of her work had been destroyed from before the war as a Jewish opera singer, and because she was no longer alive, all of her music was lost. Or so they thought. They found a recording from before the war. It was so badly damaged they couldn't get any sound out of it. And then some sound technicians worked and were able to extract 2 songs from it. And those songs were able to be played to her children. 2 of her sons survived the war, as did her husband. And then there were grandchildren as well that they were able to share it with. And so beautifully, her voice lived on. And one of the things about Pesach is this commandment to keep telling the story to our children, our children's children, our children's children, to make sure that our voices do not die with us, that they keep on going on and keep on getting passed on. And so that's why I wanted to share with you a few ideas about some of the powerful words from our seder tonight, because by repeating these words, by teaching them to the next generation, we ensure the continuity that has meant that for thousands of years, Jews all over the world have been celebrating seder, and please God, way into the future for all the time to come, we will keep celebrating the amazing miracles that happened to us then, since then, and the miracles that we are going to see, please God, now as well. So Chag Sameach, Pesach Sameach, be well, and let's all have a festival of freedom.